The pomologist's name was Dr. Grace Holloway, and she had been studying Asimina triloba, the American pawpaw, at Cornell University for 9 years. It was a niche specialty within a niche field. Most people in American horticulture treated the pawpaw as a curiosity, a footnote to the serious business of apples and pears and stone fruits, the largest edible fruit native to North America, and also the most ignored. Its commercial cultivation never having recovered from the standardization pressures of the 20th century. Grace had spent 9 years arguing, through peer-reviewed papers and extension presentations and farmer outreach programs across 8 states, that the pawpaw was not a footnote. She had mapped genetic diversity across populations from Ohio to Alabama. She understood the species better than almost anyone alive. She had not been expecting to find anything new in West Virginia in October 2019. She had come to Logan County because a horticulture student named Danny Park had done a summer internship in the region and had come back to Ithaca in September with photographs and a description of a pawpaw grove that he had found on a residential property outside the town of Man. He had described the fruit as unusual. The flesh coloration was wrong, too pale, almost bluish yellow in a species that produced custard yellow flesh in every variety he had studied. He had tasted it. He had taken photographs of the flesh and the skin and the seeds and the tree structure. He had put them on Grace's desk with a post-it note that said, "I don't know what this is. I think you should go see it." She had looked at the photographs for a long time. The flesh coloration alone was not enough. Color varied across pawpaw populations, and coloration photographs were not reliable. But the tree structure in Danny's photographs was also unusual. The branching pattern was more upright than typical Asimina triloba. The leaf morphology had a narrower profile than she associated with the Appalachian populations she had worked with, and the fruit set density in the photographs suggested a productivity rate above the standard range for wild-type trees. She had driven to Logan County on a Thursday in October. Silas Dyer was 77 years old and was on his porch when Grace's car turned off the county road. He had white hair and a large build that had been larger when he was younger and working the land full-time. Brown eyes behind thick-framed glasses, hands that had worked outdoors for 50 years and showed it. He was wearing dark work pants and a faded blue canvas work shirt and heavy boots, and he had a coffee cup in his hand, and he watched her car come up the drive with the expression of a man who is mildly curious but not surprised. He had said, "You're from Cornell." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Danny's teacher." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "I wondered if he'd say something." He had said, "It took longer than I thought it would." Grace would hear this phrase again. "It took longer than I thought it would," from old farmers who had been keeping unusual things without talking about them, and it always meant the same thing. They had known they had something. They had been patient. The patience had been longer than they had expected. Silas had walked her to the grove without preamble. The trees were behind the house, on the slope that ran down toward the creek. 7 mature trees, and 4 younger ones that he had grown from the older tree's seed over the previous 20 years. The older trees were large, very large for pawpaw, which typically grew as understory trees with modest dimensions. These had the trunk diameter of trees that had been in the ground for a long time, in conditions that suited them very well. She had reached the first tree and had looked at the fruit. Danny's photographs had not been wrong. The fruit at full ripeness had a skin that was more yellow-green than the typical deep green to yellow of commercial pawpaw varieties, with a faint bloom that gave it an almost dusty appearance. She had taken one from the lowest branch and had split it with her thumbnail. The flesh was pale, not the standard custard yellow, a very pale yellow with a visible blue-gray undertone, the color of cream that had been left in a cold place. She had looked at it for a moment. She had tasted a small piece. She had been quiet for a long time. The flavor was different. Not just different from commercial pawpaw, which was itself different from most fruit. The standard pawpaw had a flavor that people described as a cross between banana and mango with a custard texture, tropical tasting despite being a temperate species. This had that base, but had something else underneath it, something that was cooler and less sweet and more complex, an edge of something that she could not name, that sat at the back of the palate and made her want to eat another bite to find it again. She had eaten another bite. She had looked at Silas. She had said, "How long have these trees been here?" He had said, "The old ones, since before I was born." She had said, "Where did they come from?" He had said, "You'd better come inside." He had said, "This is going to take a while to explain." Ezra Dyer had been born in Logan County in 1878 and had spent most of his life within 20 miles of where he was born, which was not unusual for Logan County in the period before the coal companies had changed the landscape of the region's economy and its physical geography. The coal companies had been coming into Logan County since the late 1890s, buying mineral rights and surface rights and sometimes both, moving into hollows and valleys that had been settled by farm families for generations, and transforming them into something else. The transformation was not slow. It was rapid and comprehensive. And the families who sold, and the families who were bought out, and the families who stayed and worked the mines all experienced the same years in different ways. And the landscape that emerged from the first 2 decades of the 20th century was different in specific and permanent ways from the landscape that had preceded it. Ezra had not worked the mines. He had farmed a piece of ground on the east slope of a ridge above the Guyandotte River and had watched what happened to the valleys below him with the specific attention of a man who understood that what was happening below would eventually reach above. He had been right about that. In 1918, the Logan Coal and Coke Company had acquired the mineral rights to the valley parcel that bordered his east fence, and in 1919 had begun the surface preparation for a drift mine that would require clearing the valley floor, including a strip of wooded ground that ran along the creek. That wooded strip was where Ezra had found the pawpaw grove. He had known the grove for years, had gathered from it since he was a boy, taken his children there in September when the fruit was ripe, understood it as part of the landscape of that creek valley the way he understood all the specific features of the land he had grown up in. The grove was old. He did not know how old. His father had gathered from it and his father's father before him, and neither had planted it. It was a wild grove, native, the product of a specific combination of that valley's soil and water and light that had produced over time fruit that Ezra had always understood to be different from the pawpaws he found elsewhere in the county. Different in the specific way that Grace would taste 100 years later. The coloration, the flavor that had something extra in it, the particular quality that made Ezra return to that grove every September with his children, while other pawpaw groves in the county did not draw him the same way. When he had understood in the fall of 1919 that the Logan Coal and Coke Company's clearing operation would reach the creek strip by spring, he had done what Ezra Dyer did with things he did not want to lose, which was act before the loss was complete. He had gone to the grove on a November evening in 1919 with a spade and a wheelbarrow. He had dug 6 root ball cuttings from the largest trees, taking care to preserve as much of the root structure as he could manage in the late-season ground, wrapping the root balls in burlap sacks from the barn. He had wheeled them up the ridge road in the dark, 3 trips, and had planted them on the slope behind his house before the ground froze. He had told his wife, Nora, "I took some trees from the creek grove before the company clears it." She had looked at the slope where he had planted them. She had said, "Will they take?" He had said, "I think so." She had said, "Why those trees specifically?" He had looked at her. He had said, "Because they're the best ones." She had said, "All right." 4 of the 6 had survived. They had grown on the ridge slope behind the Dyer house for the following decades, through Ezra's remaining years, and then through his son William's time, and then through Silas's time. Silas had grown the 4 younger trees from seed in the past 20 years, after he had understood from reading about pawpaw genetics that the old tree's seed production was declining with age, and that he needed to extend the grove before it contracted. He had done this without consulting anyone. He had not talked to the Extension Service, or to a university, or to anyone in the pawpaw enthusiast community that had been growing since the 1990s. He had grown seed from the old trees because the old trees needed to continue, and he was the person responsible for continuing them, and that had been sufficient reason. Grace had spent 2 days at the Dyer property. She had taken tissue samples from all 11 trees, the 7 mature ones and the 4 younger ones, and had taken fruit samples at 3 stages of ripeness, and had photographed everything systematically, and had recorded Silas's account of the tree's history in 2 long conversations at the kitchen table. She had also, on the second afternoon, asked Silas to drive her to the site of the original creek grove. The site was now part of the reclaimed surface of a former mine operation. The Logan Coal and Coke Company had operated its drift mine through the 1940s, and the surface had been partially reclaimed in the 1970s under state regulation. What remained was a slope of mixed scrub growth, young poplars and sycamores, with a creek running at the bottom that was the same creek that had run there in 1919, but had no resemblance to the creek valley that Ezra had known. Silas had parked at the side of the road and had looked at the reclaimed slope from the car window. He had said, the grove was down along the creek, in the bottom. He had said, Ezra took the trees out in November 1919. The company cored the strip in the spring of 1920. He had said, if Ezra hadn't done what he did, those trees would have been gone 100 years ago. Grace had looked at the slope. She had said, does anyone else know what was here? He had said, anyone who grew up in this part of the county and was old enough in the 1910s to know the creek grove. He had said, there's nobody left who qualifies. She had looked at the reclaimed slope for a while. She had said, so the only record of what was here is your grove on the ridge. He had said, yes. She had been quiet. She had said, Ezra saved the trees so you would have them. He had looked at her. He had said, he saved them so they wouldn't be gone. Whether I had them or someone else had them was secondary. The point was that they wouldn't be gone. She had said, and you've kept them. He had said, they were there when I was born. I was responsible for them. He had looked at the reclaimed slope for another moment. He had said, I used to come here when I was young and try to imagine what the grove looked like. My father described it to me, and his father described it to him. Big trees, 50, 60 feet of creek bottom covered in pawpaw. He had said, Ezra could only carry 6. She had said, he carried what he could carry. He had said, yes. They had driven back to the ridge. The genetic analysis had taken 5 months and had involved 3 laboratories: Cornell's Plant Genetics Facility, a collaborating lab at West Virginia University, and a specialist in Asamina genetics at Ohio State, who had been building the most comprehensive pawpaw genetic database in existence for the previous 11 years. The Ohio State researcher was a man named Dr. Philip Crame, who had cataloged pawpaw genetics across 14 states and had developed the reference database against which new samples were compared. He had received Grace's samples in November and had called her in February with results that he described, in a voicemail she had listened to 3 times, as the most significant finding in his 11 years of pawpaw work. The Dyer Grove trees carried a genetic profile that did not match any population in his database. Not closely, not approximately. The profile was distinct in multiple markers, consistent with a population that had been isolated in a specific valley system for a long period and had developed its own genetic character through that isolation. The pale flesh coloration and the flavor complexity that Grace had noticed were consistent with the genetic distinctiveness. They were phenotypic expressions of a genotype that had not been recorded anywhere in the literature. Philip had said in the voicemail, "Grace, this is a population that was not connected to any of the known West Virginia populations I have data on. It developed separately. It may have been isolated in that Logan County Valley system since before European settlement. The creek drainage there runs in a different watershed direction from the main Guyandotte tributaries. It would have been genetically isolated from the other county populations for a long time." He had said, "If Silas's account is accurate about when those trees were transplanted, what you have on that ridge is the last survivors of a population that was otherwise destroyed in 1920. He had said, "Call me when you can." She had called him from Silas's kitchen table, with Silas sitting across from her so that Silas could hear the conversation directly. Philip had said, "Mr. Dyer, your grandfather may have saved the only surviving example of a distinct pawpaw population that developed in isolation in that valley system. Everything else was gone when the mine cleared the creek bottom." He had said, "The trees on your ridge are it." Silas had been quiet for a long time. He had said, "Ezra knew they were the best trees." Philip had said, "Your grandfather had good judgment." Silas had said, he didn't need a genetic database to know what was worth saving. Philip had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "No, he didn't." He had said, "But the genetic database is how we tell the rest of the world what he saved." Silas had looked at the kitchen window that faced the slope where the trees grew. He had said, "All right." He had said, "Use it." The cultivar designation process had been initiated by Grace in the spring of 2020 and had moved through the standard academic and horticultural review processes over the following year. The question of what to name the new designation had been the subject of a conversation between Grace and Silas that had taken place on the porch of the Dyer house on a June evening, when the pawpaw trees on the slope were in their early summer growth, and the Logan County ridges were green in the long evening light. Grace had said, "The naming convention for a newly designated pawpaw cultivar can follow different approaches. It can be geographic, descriptive, or it can honor a person." She had said, "Given the history of these trees, I'd like your guidance." Silas had been quiet for a while. He had said, "Ezra." She had said, "Ezra Dyer." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "We could call it Dyer's Creek, after the creek where the original grove was. Or we could call it Ezra." He had thought about it. He had said, "Ezra went down to the creek in November in the dark with a spade and a wheelbarrow." He had said, "Not Dyer's Creek. The creek is gone." He had said, "Ezra." The cultivar was designated Asamina triloba Ezra in the Journal of the American Pomological Society, publication of November 2021. The paper's abstract noted that the cultivar represented the surviving remnant of an isolated Logan County Valley population, transplanted to a ridge location in November 1919 by Ezra Dyer prior to the commercial clearing of its original habitat, and maintained in continuous cultivation by subsequent generations of the Dyer family for 100 years. Silas had received a copy of the published paper from Grace. He had read it at the kitchen table. He had been quiet for a while. He had said to his wife Loretta, who had been at the table beside him, "It says Ezra." She had said, "I heard." He had said, "I wish he could read it." She had said, "He knew what he had." He said, "Yes." She had said, "That's enough, isn't it?" He had looked at the paper. He had said, "I think so." Danny Park had come back to Logan County the summer after the paper was published to help Silas with the propagation work. Danny was 24 years old and had chosen pawpaw genetics for his dissertation, partly because of what he had found on that October afternoon 2 years earlier, when he had knocked on Silas's door on a hunch and had been shown 11 trees on a West Virginia ridge that he had recognized, even without the genetic analysis, as something that needed to be looked at more carefully. He had asked Silas, on one of those summer mornings, what it had been like to grow up with the trees. Silas had thought about it. He had said, they were just there, the way things are just there when you grow up with them. He had said, my father told me what Ezra had done when I was old enough to understand it. He had said, after that, I knew they were specific. Before that, they were just the pawpaw trees on the slope. Danny had said, when did you start thinking of yourself as responsible for them? Silas had looked at the trees. He had said, when my father died. He had said, he told me before he went, those trees are yours now. Take care of them. I asked him what I needed to do. He said, what I did, what Ezra did. He had said, keep them in the ground and keep them producing and don't let them end. Danny had said, that's what Agnes's note said, about the wild rice in Minnesota. Silas had said, I don't know about that. He had said, but that's what you did with things you were responsible for. You kept them going. Danny had been quiet. He had said, and now there's a paper and a name in the journal. Silas had said, yes. He had said, Ezra would have said, the paper was for other people. The trees were for the trees. Danny had said, what does that mean? Silas had looked at him. He had said, the trees don't need the paper to be what they are. The paper is so that other people can understand what the trees are. The trees just need to be in the ground and producing. That was true in 1919, and it's true now. Danny had written this in his notebook. He had a notebook. He had started it the day he came back to Logan County, on the advice of Grace, who had told him, if you're going to work in this field, you need to write down what the farmers tell you, not just the data, what they say about what they're doing and why. She had said, that's where the knowledge is. He had said, in their words. She had said, in their relationship to the thing. The words are the closest you'll get to it on paper. He was getting closer. He had a long way to go. That was fine. The trees had been on the ridge for 100 years. There was time. The grove on the ridge above the Dyer house had 11 trees in the fall of 2021 and had 12 in the fall of 2022. A new one that Silas and Danny had grown together from seed that season and planted in October at the south end of the slope where the light was right and the drainage was right, and the ground was the same ground that Ezra's transplanted trees had been growing in since 1919. Silas had said when they planted it, this one's for Danny. Danny had said, you don't have to do that. Silas had said, you came and knocked on my door. He had said, if you hadn't, Grace wouldn't have come. And if Grace hadn't come, the trees would still just be trees on a West Virginia ridge that nobody outside this county knew about. Danny had said, they would have been fine either way. Silas had looked at him. He had said, yes, that's true. He had said, but now other people know what Ezra did, and that matters to me. He had said, so this one's for Danny. They had planted the tree in October, the same month that Ezra had gone down to the creek in 1919 with a spade and a wheelbarrow. The ground was cold, and the Logan County ridges were going into their fall colors, and the creek in the valley below was not the creek that Ezra had known, but was still a creek, still running south toward the Guyandotte, still present. Silas had tamped the soil around the new tree's root ball and had stood up and looked at the slope. 12 trees now. The old ones large and dark-barked, the younger ones thinner and more upright, the newest one barely knee-high. He had said, Ezra carried 6 root balls up a ridge road in the dark in November 1919. 4 survived. Those 4 are those 4. He had said, from 4 trees, 12. He had said, that's what 100 years looks like. Danny had looked at the 12 trees on the slope. He had said, and in another 100 years? Silas had said, that depends on who's here. He had looked at Danny. He had said, you'll be here for some of it. Danny had said, yes. Silas had said, then pay attention. Danny had said, I will. Silas had said, good. He had said, Ezra paid attention. My father paid attention. I paid attention. He said, that's the whole instruction. He had picked up the spade and walked back toward the barn. Danny had stood at the new tree for a while, in the October afternoon, on the Logan County Ridge, looking at 12 pawpaw trees that would not be there if one man had not gone down to a creek in the dark 100 years ago with a spade and a wheelbarrow, and the specific understanding that some things were worth carrying up a hill before it was too late. That was the whole instruction. Pay attention. Carry what you can carry. Keep it in the ground. Do not let it end. William Dyer had been 42 years old when Ezra died in 1951, old enough to have spent 20 years working alongside his father and learning what Ezra knew about the farm and the land and the specific things Ezra cared about. The pawpaw trees on the slope had been part of what Ezra cared about in a way that William understood without it ever having been fully explained. Ezra had shown him the trees when William was a child and had told him where they came from: the creek grove, the coal company clearing, the November night with the wheelbarrow, and had said, "These trees are particular. They are not like the pawpaws on the road cut or in the creek bottoms elsewhere in the county." He had said, "I don't know exactly why they're different. I know that they are." He had said, "When I'm gone, they're yours to keep." William had kept them. He had farmed the same ridgeland his father had farmed, and had harvested from the slope grove every September, and had told his children what Ezra had told him, the same story in the same words approximately, because the story did not need improvement. He had told Silas when Silas was 12 years old, sitting under the largest of the old trees in September, with a pawpaw in each hand, eating. He had said, "Your great-grandfather dug these trees out of the creek bottom the night before the coal company came to clear it. He carried them up the ridge road in a wheelbarrow." Silas had said, "Why?" William had said, "Because they were the best trees." He had said, "There were better pawpaws on that creek than anywhere else in the county." Ezra knew it. He didn't want them to be gone. Silas had said, "Did it work?" William had looked at the 4 trees on the slope. He had said, "Here they are." Silas had said, "What happened to the creek grove?" William had said, "Gone. Company cleared it in 1920. He had said, if Ezra hadn't carried these up the hill, they would have been gone too. Silas had looked at the trees. He had said, "Good thing he did." William had said, "Yes." He had said, "That's why you'll keep them when I'm gone." Silas had been 12 years old and had not said anything. He had understood what was being said. He had been 66 years old when William died. By then, the keeping had been going on for 30 years without being explicitly discussed as keeping. It was what you did with the trees on the slope. You harvested from them in September, and you ate the fruit, and you watched the trees for trouble, and you did what they needed. When one of the older trees had shown signs of crown decline in 2001, Silas had not known specifically what to do about it, and had read about pawpaw cultivation until he understood enough to manage the situation, which had taken 2 seasons and several consultations with the Extension Office in Logan, and had ultimately resolved in the tree's recovery. He had done this without talking to anyone in the pawpaw research community, because he had not known the pawpaw research community existed. He was a man in Logan County who had trees on his ridge that needed to be looked after. The tree that had shown crown decline in 2001 was still producing in 2022. Loretta Dyer had her own understanding of the trees, which was different from Silas's, and equally complete. Loretta had grown up in Mingo County and had not known about pawpaws in the specific way that Logan County Ridge families knew about them. She had married Silas in 1969 and had come to the Ridge property and had eaten her first fruit from the Slope Grove in September of that year. She had been surprised by the flavor in the way of someone who had eaten grocery store pawpaws before and had assumed she knew what a pawpaw tasted like. She had said to Silas that evening, "These are different from what I've had before." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "How?" He had said, "They're from the creek grove." She had said, "What creek grove?" He had told her the story of Ezra and the wheelbarrow and the November night. She had listened carefully. She had said, "And nobody else knows about these?" He had said, "People in the county know there are good pawpaws on this ridge. Not many people know where they came from." She had said, "Should you tell someone?" He had looked at the trees. He had said, "Who would I tell?" She had said, "I don't know. Someone who studies these things." He had said, "I don't know if there's anyone who studies these things." She had said, "Probably there is." He had said, "Probably." He had said, "But right now the trees are fine. If the trees needed something I didn't know how to give them, I'd go find out." She had understood this as his answer and had not pressed. She had been pressing gently, in her way, for 50 years. She had said, in 2005, when the internet made finding things easier, that she had looked up pawpaw research and there was a community, and Silas should contact them. He had said, "The trees are fine." She had said, "They might know things you don't know." He had said, "They might." He had said, "But right now the trees are fine." She had said, "Silas." He had said, "Loretta." They had had this conversation in various forms over 15 years. He was not being difficult. He was genuinely uncertain about what benefit external contact would provide, while the trees remained healthy. The trees were the point. They were in good condition and producing reliably, and he understood what they needed. The external validation was for other people. When Danny Park had knocked on the door in October 2019, Silas had said to Loretta afterward, "You were right." She had said, "I know." He had said, "It took longer than I thought it would." She had said, "You always think it'll take longer than it does." She had been right about that too. He had looked at the kitchen table for a moment. He had said, "The trees are what they are, regardless of whether Danny came." She had said, "Yes." She had said, "But now other people know what they are, and that matters." He had said, "Yes, I know it matters. I was just making sure the trees mattered first." She had said, "They always mattered first." He had said, "Yes." The propagation program that Grace had established at Cornell in partnership with the West Virginia University Extension Service had, by 2022, produced 40 grafted trees from the Dyer Grove stock. The trees had been distributed to 8 locations across West Virginia and Kentucky, university research stations, botanical gardens, and 3 private farms whose owners had been identified through the pawpaw enthusiast community as appropriate custodians. Silas had been involved in selecting the distribution partners. Grace had presented the options to him and had explained each facility's or farm's background and capacity. He had asked questions about the soil conditions at each location, about who specifically would be responsible for the trees, about whether the people involved understood what they were being given. He had said, "It's not enough to want to grow these trees. You have to understand that they require specific attention and that the attention has to be consistent." Grace had said, "That's why I want your input on the selection." He had said, "Who understands that best?" She had said, "The 3 farms." He had said, "Start there." They had started with the 3 farms. The university research stations and botanical gardens had received trees in the 2nd distribution year once Grace had been satisfied that the farm custodians' documentation of their management approaches met the standard she and Silas had discussed. Silas had said, Ezra didn't have a standard. He had a spade and a wheelbarrow and good judgment. Grace had said, "You can't distribute good judgment through a propagation program." Silas had said, "No, that's why you use the standard instead." She had written this in the paper's discussion section, attributed to him. He had read the attribution and had said, "That's fine." He had said, "It's what I said." She had said, "It's also a good observation." He had said, "It's just what's true." The Logan County ridges in October had a specific quality of light that Silas had known his whole life. The angle and color of it through the hardwoods going into fall. The way it came across the slope in the morning and the evening and showed you the ground clearly when you were working in it. He had worked in that light for 70 years, and he did not need it to be different. He walked the grove every morning, the way he had walked it every morning for most of his adult life. Not in an organized way, not systematically, with a clipboard. In the way of a man who goes to the same place every day and looks at it until he understands what it needs. This took different amounts of time on different days. Some mornings, he was back at the house in 20 minutes. Some mornings, he was in the grove for an hour. Danny had observed this routine on 3 separate visits and had not fully understood it until the 3rd visit, when he had asked Silas what he was looking for on the morning walks. Silas had said, "I'm not looking for anything specific. I'm looking at everything." He had said, "You can't find what's wrong with a tree if you only look at it when you think something might be wrong. You have to look at it until you know what right looks like, and then you notice when right looks different." Danny had said, "How long did it take to know what right looked like?" Silas had said, "A long time." He had said, "I'm still learning, but I have a pretty good idea." He had looked at the 12 trees on the slope in the October morning. He had said, Ezra had a pretty good idea too. He had said, that's how he knew which trees to take. Danny had stood in the grove for a while after he left. The October light came across the slope and showed the trees clearly, 12 of them, 4 old and 8 younger. The fruit mostly harvested now, the leaves beginning to turn at the edges. The ground was good ground. The creek in the valley was not the creek that Ezra had known, but the ridge was the ridge that Ezra had known. And the trees were the trees that Ezra had carried up the hill in the dark 100 years ago. 100 years. 4 trees carry up a hill became 12 trees on a ridge, became a published paper in a pomology journal, became 40 grafted trees at 8 locations across 2 states. That was what 100 years looked like. That was what Ezra's judgment looked like, 100 years later, in the October light on a Logan County ridge. Pay attention. Carry what you can carry. Keep it in the ground. Do not let it end. Philip Crane had driven from Columbus to Logan County in June 2020, 8 months after Grace's first visit and 4 months after the genetic results had come back. He had wanted to see the trees himself. He had been building the pawpaw genetic database for 11 years and had driven to a lot of properties across a lot of states and had found a lot of interesting things. He had not found anything he would describe as surprising in the way the Dyer Grove had surprised him. He had said to Silas, standing under the oldest tree in the June morning with the fruit set just beginning to show, "I have data on pawpaw populations from Ohio to Alabama. I have profiles for every major wild population and most of the cultivated ones." He had said, "What you have here does not appear in my database." He had said, "That means it developed independently of everything else I've documented." He had said, "The coal company clearing in 1920 removed the rest of the population. This grove is the only thing that survived." Silas had said, "Because Ezra had a wheelbarrow." Philip had looked at him. He had said, "Yes, exactly because of that." He had said, "I want you to understand what that means scientifically. Every other tree from that valley population is gone. 100 years of surface mining and reclamation and no restoration of the original understory. It's not coming back naturally." He had said, "These 11 trees are it." Silas had said, "I know they're it. I've known they were particular my whole life." Philip had said, "Particular is one word for it." He had said, "In genetic terms, they represent a unique lineage that exists nowhere else." Silas had said, "That's what Ezra thought too. He just didn't have the genetic terms." Philip had looked at the trees. He had said, "No." He had said, he had better terms. He had said, he called them the best trees. Silas had looked at Philip. He had said, "Yes." He had said, "That's right." Philip had stayed for 2 days. He had taken additional samples and had spent long periods in the grove with his instruments and notebooks, and had asked Silas many questions about the management history and the tree health and the specific observations Silas had made about the grove over the decades. He had been thorough and attentive, and had taken nothing for granted, which Silas appreciated in the specific way he appreciated people who did not assume they understood something before they had looked at it carefully. On the evening before he left, Philip had said, "Mr. Dyer, in 11 years of this work, I have never encountered a situation where a single family decision, one person with a spade, made the difference between a unique genetic lineage surviving or disappearing." He had said, "The Dyer Grove exists because Ezra made a specific choice in a specific moment, and because 3 generations of your family honored that choice by keeping the trees in the ground." He had said, "That's not a scientific phenomenon. That's a human one." Silas had said, "It's both." Philip had said, "Yes, it's both." He had driven back to Columbus in the morning. Silas had a son named Robert, who lived in Charleston, and a daughter named Patricia, who lived in Beckley, and neither of them had grown up with the same relationship to the grove that Silas had developed. Robert had worked the ridge property summers through high school and had eaten the September pawpaws, and had known the story of Ezra and the wheelbarrow the same way he knew other family stories, as something that was part of the background of who they were, interesting but not pressing. Patricia had heard the story the same way. Both of them had read the published paper. Both of them had called Silas afterward. Robert had said, "Dad, this is in a national journal." Silas had said, "Yes." Robert had said, "They named it after Ezra." Silas had said, "Yes." Robert had said, "How do you feel about that?" Silas had been quiet. He had said, "I feel like the trees should still be here in another 100 years. Robert had said, "Is that going to happen?" Silas had said, "That's what the propagation program is for." He had said, "Grace has 40 grafted trees at 8 locations." Robert had said, 40 trees, from 4 that Ezra carried up the hill. Silas had said, 4 that survived. He had said, "He carried 6. Robert had said, "Right, 6. Silas had said, "He lost 2 in the first winter." He had said, 4 became 11. 11 became 40 at 8 locations. He had said, "That's what the work looks like over time." Robert had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "You've been keeping these trees for 60 years. Silas had said, "About that." Robert had said, "Did you know they were this important?" Silas had been quiet. He had said, "I knew they were particular. I knew Ezra had done something specific in bringing them here." He had said, "The importance in the scientific sense, that's Grace's finding. What I knew was that the trees needed to be looked after." Robert had said, "And you looked after them." Silas had said, "Yes." He had said, "That's all I did." Robert had said, "That's not nothing." Silas had said, "No, it's not nothing." He had said, "But it's also not complicated." He had said, "The trees were here. I was responsible for them. I did what you do with things you're responsible for." Robert had said, "Which is?" Silas had said, "You keep them in the ground and producing, and you don't let them end." He had said, "Ezra said that. William said that. I'm saying it." He had said, "You should probably know it too." Robert had been quiet. He had said, "All right, Dad, I hear you." Silas had said, "Good." He had said, "Come see the grove in September. We'll harvest together." Robert had said, "I'll come." Silas had said, "Bring the kids." Robert had said, "The kids don't know anything about pawpaws." Silas had said, "That's why you bring 'em." Robert had come in September. He had brought his 2 children. They had harvested from the grove, and Silas had told them the story of Ezra and the wheelbarrow. The same story in approximately the same words, the same way William had told him, and the same way Ezra had told William. The children had listened with the variable attention of children hearing a family story for the first time, part of it landing and part of it passing by, but enough landing that when they ate the fruit from the grove, they understood, in the way children could understand things without fully articulating them, that what they were eating was connected to something that had been kept for a long time by specific people for specific reasons. The older child, a girl named Emma who was 12, had said, So if great-great-great-grandfather Ezra hadn't gotten the trees, there would be no trees now? Silas had said, "The creek grove is gone. These are the only ones." She had said, "So he saved them." He had said, "He kept them." She had said, "What's the difference?" He had looked at her. He had said, "Saving is what you do in an emergency. Keeping is what you do every day." She had thought about this for a moment. She had said, "But the emergency started the keeping." Silas had looked at her. He had said, "Yes, that's right." He had said, "The emergency was one night. The keeping has been 100 years." She had said, "And it keeps going." Silas had said, "If someone keeps going with it, yes." She had looked at the trees. She had said, "Will someone?" He had looked at her. He had said, "You're someone." She had looked at him for a moment. Then she had looked at the trees. She had said, "Okay." Silas had looked at the grove. 12 trees on the Logan County ridge, the September light coming through the hardwoods, the burgundy yellow fruit heavy in the branches. 4 trees that Ezra had carried up a hill 100 years ago. The rest built from those 4. Okay, one word from a 12-year-old girl in September, in the grove on the ridge. That was enough.